afternoon, everybody. Warm welcome. Welcome to the second day, day 2 of the Enhanced Transparency Framework training sessions. So yesterday, Federico and Sanju provided an overview of the whole context of the ETF. Today, we will get into the nitty-gritty, and perhaps you would be able to relate more to it in your respective sectors. Of course, in our forthcoming meetings, we're going to talk about it for your sectors. Thank you. Over to you, Federico.
So thank you, Desh. Thank you, everyone, for joining in today as well. So today I'm going to start where we left yesterday and finish the presentation of the MPGs and how that relates to the reporting requirements in the new BTR reports. And then later on, we'll go to more in-depth looking at indicators for domestic NRB purposes and tracking progress of NDC. I have tried in the next presentation to relate it slightly more to Mauritius NDC and its own targets and actions and policies that it has submitted through its NDC. And then during the Q&A session, I think Sanju will be able to provide some more inputs and details about the Mauritian context and maybe also your respective sectors. We have shorter presentations today because we're expecting maybe a longer session of questions and answers. So we'll leave, I think, enough time as we are going into material that is more related to your daily work. We decided to keep more time for Q&A. So the content of today's presentation is the second part of the BTR requirements on support needed and received, and on climate change impacts and adaptation. And I will also introduce the adaptation communication. So even though in the BTR, climate change impacts and adaptation comes first, if you look at the chapters themselves, that's chapter 4, the description of the MPGs. I will jump over it now and come back to it later. We're talking about the adaptation communication because I can talk about those two at the same time. So here we'll talk about the information required on support needed and received first. And it's important to note that reporting on support needed and received in the BTR is a should requirement for developing countries and is not therefore mandatory. And also, should also keep in mind that the MPGs provide a guidance on information on support provided and mobilized, which is to be provided by developed countries. But we'll not look at that here. But nevertheless, any developing country providing support, if a developing country is providing support to other developing countries, they are encouraged to report on this information as well. So it's a quite comprehensive table. I'll take you through it step by step. I try to summarize the reporting requirements in a structured format. So this is not it's not described in this way in the MPGs. I try to systematize it. But basically, the information on support needed and received is requested by the MPGs, both in textual and tabular formats. And the textual information to be provided, it consists of the following details that is illustrated here, and I'll try to describe this table. The columns to the right have some initials representing different categories of information. The description of these categories is below the table. So FN is financial support needed, FR, financial support received, TDTN is technology development and transfer support needed, TDTR is technology development and transfer support received, CBN is capacity building support needed, BR is capacity building support received, and ST is actually support needed and received for the implementation of Article 13. That means it's support needed and received for transparency. So there is a specific section for the support needed and received to enhance the transparency capacities as well. So the table basically illustrates the kind of information requested for each category in tabular format And you can see some of the information requested is common for all, while some is not. For information requested in textual format, I mean, here in the tabular format, we have standard information and quite easy to provide, and some more complex. So the program, project description, the channel, recipient entity, implementing entity, the type of technology. And you can see technology is related for the technology support, so it's only required for technology. Recipient entity, of course, is only for support received, not for support needed. But this gives an overview of the kind of information that is requested and the granularity of this information requested in tabular formats. An important aspect is also the expected or utilized financial instrument. So it's actually something that countries should consider. Are we talking about grants for adaptation activities? Are we talking about loans for infrastructure projects? But also the expected and achieved use, impact, and estimated results, the last one. So it's not enough to just report that you need support for a specific project, but also it's important to provide information on the use, impacts, and results of what this activity would lead to. So there is also some analytical work that will have to be provided when describing support needed as well. For the information requested in textual formats on the financial support needed, the countries also need to provide information on the sectors for which the country wishes to attract international finance, also which existing barriers to attracting international finance the country faces, and a description of how the support will contribute to the NDC and the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. So there's also more analytical work to be done and some also qualitative information to be provided. And when providing information on technology development and transfer support needed, countries should also report on plans, needs, and priorities related to technology development and transfer, also including those identified in technology needs assessments. And I know that Mauritius has been to a TNA process, and this kind of connects the dots to the TNA work. To report information on capacity building support needed, a country should also describe the approach it seeks to take to enhance the capacity building support and its capacity building needs and constraints and gaps in communicating needs as well. So we know that if you read through different national communications or other reports, sometimes the argumentation for the needs is not that extensive and it's not totally understood. So this might be a requirement that comes in terms of what are the challenges and gaps in communicating the needs themselves and what can be done to enhance that. There's also be some information on the process for enhancing public awareness, public participation, and access to information in relation to capacity building. When reporting on technology development and transfer support received, and also the capacity building support received in textual format, countries should also provide information on which existing case studies are there available, also including key success and failure stories to report on what works and what has not been so successful. On technology support received, countries should also report on how the support contributes to technology development and transfer, also with endogenous capacities and know-how, and the stage of the technology cycle supported. So is it research and development, demonstration, or is it deployment or diffusion, or also transfer of technology? And for capacity support received, countries should also report on how the support has enhanced the country's capacities. Also, if the support was received at a national or sub-regional or regional level, and the priorities, participation, and the involvement of stakeholders. So we also see a big emphasis on the involvement of stakeholders in countries. And finally, when reporting information on support needed and received for the implementation of Article 13 related to transparency activities, countries should provide information on support needed and received to prepare reports to the UNFCCC. This is the main goals. So you might already know the global support program that supports the development of national communications and BURs. And also this information should be on addressing the areas for improvement identified by the technical experts review teams as part of the UNFCCC review process. And also, in providing this detailed information of support needed and received in the BTR, developing countries should also provide information on the underlying assumptions, definitions, and methodologies used to provide this information. So again, we saw this this emphasis on information on methodologies and assumptions on NDC tracking, and we see it here as well also for support needed and received. So now we go over to the requirements concerning the adaptation communication and information related to climate change impacts and adaptation under Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, the one related to adaptation. It should also be noted that there is sort of decision, COP decision and guidance on information that should be in the adaptation communication, but there is also the MPGs, which is the information requested in the BTR, and actually the information on climate impacts and adaptation in the BTR is more detailed than the information requested in for the guidance for the adaptation communication. So countries should consider maybe looking at the BTR requirements on climate impacts and adaptation when working on their adaptation communication if they wish to submit such a document. So I will address these kind of topics together. We'll take as a starting point the requirements of the MPGs. Let's see, it might be appropriate to start off by explaining the difference between the adaptation communication and information related to climate change impacts and adaptation. So under, and become kind of technical here, but under paragraph 10 and 11 of Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, adaptation communications are described as reports which may include information on adaptation priorities, implementation and support needs, and adaptation plans and actions. So adaptation communication should be submitted and updated periodically, and it's still just a should requirement, so it's not mandatory. And it should only be submitted as appropriate and without creating additional burden for developing countries. But more specifically, an adaptation communication, if submitted, they shall, as appropriate, be submitted and updated periodically as components of or in conjunction with other communications or documents. So they should basically be submitted either with the BTR or the national communication or the NDC. So basically, parties can flexibly decide on which document they want to report their adaptation communication. And also the MPGs state that further guidance in relation to the adaptation communication to be prepared, and we have a short document. But again, looking at the BTR requirements can actually guide parties in deciding which information to include in it. So looking at the adaptation communication description from the UNFCCC, it has a purpose, and basically to increase the visibility and profile of adaptation and its balance with mitigation, to strengthen adaptation action and support for developing countries, provide input to the global stocktake, and enhance learning and understanding of adaptation needs and action. So under the Paris Agreement, the parties can decide to submit adaptation communications as components of or in conjunction with other communication, as mentioned. And in addition, the MPGs state that the parties have now the choice to submit the adaptation communication as part of the BTR. But if they do so, the country should clearly identify which part of the report is the adaptation communication. So it should clearly be defined as such even within the BTR. So the MPGs do not provide any guidance on the adaptation communication itself, and it comes from a separate decision of COP. And this decision states that the information may be used when submitting the adaptation communication as part of the NDC, but nothing is explicitly said on specific requirements for its submission as part of the BTR or national communication. But we assume that it's basically the same guidance. And finally, decision 9 CMA, which is the decision I'm referring to, that describes the adaptation communication. It acknowledges that parties that choose to submit their adaptation communication as part of a national communication or national adaptation plan may provide information taking into consideration this guidance that I will go through in more depth. So this decision, let's see here, basically states that in their national communications, countries may provide information on measures to mitigate climate change and measures to facilitate adequate adaptation to climate change. So regarding what counts as relevant information, the guidelines mention information on vulnerability to the adverse effects of climate change and on adaptation measures being taken, information on the scope of countries' vulnerability and adaptation assessments, including identification of the vulnerable areas that are most critical, a description of approaches, methodologies, and tools used to assess the impacts of and vulnerability and adaptation to climate change, as well as any uncertainties inherent in these methodologies, and information on the vulnerability to the impacts of and adaptation to climate change in key vulnerable areas. Also, draft supplementary guidance to be used voluntarily when compiling an adaptation communication should become available by June 2022. So we'll have more information on what should go into an adaptation communication. And it's currently being drafted by the Adaptation Committee in cooperation with the IPCC Working Group 2, and it will be submitted to COP by November 2022 to make a decision on this final document or guidance. So due to the lack of current guidance, we also suggest that countries could make use of the information listed in the MPGs under the chapter on climate change impacts and adaptation to compile their adaptation communication. So using this approach when preparing an adaptation communication before December 2024 can help countries get ready for submission of information as part of the BTR and also ensure consistencies in the reporting information. So basically, what is this information that is described in the BTR requirements? The MPGs are actually quite detailed compared to the other adaptation communication guidance. However, all the reporting requirements in terms of climate change impacts and adaptation are not mandatory. They are either a should requirement or even less stringent, what is called a may requirement. So it's not only voluntary, but also some of the information is optional. The information is structured in the following blocks: national circumstances, institutional arrangements and legal frameworks relevant for adaptation, impacts, risks and vulnerabilities, adaptation priorities and barriers, adaptation strategies, policies, plans, goals and actions, progress on implementation of adaptation, monitoring and evaluation of adaptation actions and processes, information related to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, and also cooperation, good practices, experience, and lessons learned. I must also say that this information is I mean, when adaptation is such a big priority for a lot of countries, especially developing countries, having this information also can ease the task of describing and providing the climate rationale when requesting international finance. So even though it's a should requirement and not mandatory, I think that a lot of the countries prioritizing adaptation should really consider to start analytical work and start gathering data and information to have this information available that can assist them in actually having the needed information when requesting international finance or international support to implement adaptation interventions. And finally, coming back to what we were saying in the previous slide, about the possibility of using the MPG guidance to compile an adaptation communication. We have a snap here from a publication that we have made here at the UNEP-DTU partnership, where you can see a comparison of the level of detail requested by the three guiding documents. So the BTR, NDC, and national communications in the second, third, and fourth column. So it is clearly visible that the guidance on information to be reported on climate change impacts and adaptation as part of the BTR is more detailed than the guidance for adaptation communication. This is just a short snapshot, but basically all these reports need to provide some information on national circumstances, institutional arrangements, and legal frameworks relevant to adaptation. And here the BTR basically says you need to provide information on institutional arrangements and governance, legal and policy frameworks and regulation, biogeophysical characteristics, demographics, economy, infrastructure, while the description or the guidance for adaptation communication just says national circumstances, institutional arrangements, and legal frameworks. And the table is longer in its entirety. So this is just to give an example. While the national communication, when it talks about information on adaptation, it just states that information on features on geography, climate, and economy which may affect the ability to deal with mitigation and adapting to climate. And that's it for this presentation on adaptation and support. I think let's have a quick recap from the sessions from yesterday and up until now, up until today. We have started with presenting the transition to the Paris Agreement and the ETF role in it by showing the connections between the information that will be recorded within it and the different articles of the Paris Agreement. So we went through the Paris Agreement, some introduction to some of the articles and some of the paragraphs of Article 13. We have provided an overview of the main features of the communication of the ETF, including the timeline for its realization, so by when the BTR needs to be submitted. And then we have moved more into the BTR and how the MPGs for transparency describes what information will go into the BTR. And in the last presentation, we have looked into each of these blocks of information so that we have gone through the BTR sections step by step. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into every small nitty-gritty detail of all the information requested. So for those of you who are interested, we can refer to one of our publications or the MPGs themselves. And if so, you can write me an email and I will share this information with you. And finally, some take-home messages. So even though the BTR will be submitted in 2024, the MPGs provide some information linked to NDC requirements and other current submissions. So it will be beneficial for countries to study the MPGs also when working on other reports and submissions to the UNFCCC. Preparing NDCs or other reports taking into account the MPGs will therefore help countries to identify gaps in current information. So thus basically ensure that there is some time to collect the necessary information before the enhanced transparency framework becomes effective by the end of 2024. The exception made for LDCs and SIDS with respect to BTR submission and the flexibility provisions for developing countries basically still give countries that need less stringent requirements. It gives them the option to omit certain information and details, but as I have underlined, the self-determined need for flexibility will need to be explained, and plans to improve reporting over time will need to be drawn upon. So in this way, together with the emphasis on the creation, maintenance, and continuous improvement of national frameworks for transparency, the MPGs also provide the framework for moving towards common reporting and improved modes of reporting for all parties over time. So with this, if you just give me a couple of seconds, I will, we'll take questions at the end of the next presentation. Here we'll go more into things that you maybe can put easier into context in your daily work and your climate actions that your respective institutions are in charge of, and it's basically looking at indicators for domestic MRV purposes and tracking progress of NDC. If we have future training sessions, we might also talk about institutional arrangements and how this data flows, how this data can be gathered, and how this and how to put up systems for data sharing. A part of the NAMA project work is actually to set up virtual platform for reporting and for storing information and tracking progress of the, at least starting with mitigation actions and might be further developed to address the other aspects of the MPGs, so tracking of adaptation, support, etc. But this might be for a different training. So for now, we'll just look at indicators, and we might come back to other topics on another time. So looking at the content of this presentation, I will start by introducing the changes, some of the changes on reporting from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement reporting framework. I will slightly touch upon, again, I mentioned it during one of my previous presentations, but basically the complexity of tracking different types of NDC targets. Then I will talk about the reporting requirements of NDC targets and climate action, and give also some examples of indicators and potential applicability to the Mauritian context. And this will still be at a quite overall view, but I guess that in your working groups and with Sanju, you will have also the possibility to go more in depth on specific activity level data that might feed information into this more overall indicators. So the current transparency requirements under the UNFCCC provide for a set of differentiated guidelines between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 parties to the convention. And I say the current because the enhanced transparency framework has not come into effect yet. It will do so by the submission of the first BTR by 31st December 2024. And while the current reporting focuses on similar issues for the two groups of countries, the main differences occur in terms of obligation, the level of detail, the frequency, and format. So such general considerations also apply to areas relevant to monitoring progress itself. So Annex 1 parties, the developed country parties, are subject to targets under the Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. And they are therefore also subject to requirements of reporting on the progress towards the achievement of these targets. And because of the timeline developed countries have had in terms of enhancing the reporting abilities, these countries have a long experience in reporting against targets, while non-Annex 1 countries or developing countries have only recently, with the targets set by the NDC and the Paris Agreement, entered into this requirement of needing to track their progress against specific targets. So the current bifurcated requirements, they also provide a significantly different starting point in dealing with the new provisions of the enhanced transparency framework. And now that all parties have expressed their targets through the NDCs, developing countries will have to prepare for enhancing the transparency framework. And in this context, and waiting for a detailed description of the content of the BTR, because we now have the MPGs that describe the content, but we also are waiting for common reporting tables. Those of you that have worked with inventories are probably aware that there are common reporting tables for inventories, but there are also common reporting tables for a lot of the information that is reported through the other reports. But nevertheless, the current experiences and established systems for monitoring and reporting for developed countries can provide valuable inputs for enhancing developing countries' national transparency frameworks. So, as already mentioned in previous presentations, the key reporting element is the BTR, whose first submission by 31st December 2024. And the outline, as I mentioned, has been negotiated, and will have to include, amongst others, information necessary to track progress made in implementing and achieving NDCs. So all parties shall report on this information. There is no way around it. And it's a highly detailed list of information on indicators and relevant methodologies and accounting approaches, also including on targets. And you have to be reported through also a structured summary whose format is currently being negotiated under a specific body of the convention. So many NDCs have included policies and measures as part of their mitigation contribution or contributing to their mitigation contribution. So basically, I was saying that many NDCs have included specific policies and measures as a part of their NDC, or specific policies and measures that will contribute to their NDC targets. And information on these policies and measures is also requested in order to track NDC progress. And therefore, here, indicators to track implementation of these policies and measures is also a natural continuation of the identification of indicators to track the progress of the overall NDC targets. Basically, a greater level of detail will be required for monitoring progress towards parties' domestic targets compared to the current arrangements, and especially for those, but not limited to, developing country parties. And these arrangements are made more complex by the fact that, unlike developed countries in the Kyoto Protocol, where we had all the targets expressed as quantified emissions, limitations, or reductions, compared to a specific base year period, so all the developed country parties had the same time of ways of measuring targets. Parties NDC targets today under the Paris Agreement, they are very different in nature, or they're expressed in different manners, especially when we look at the mitigation component. And therefore, also the indicators to be used to track progress towards their implementation and achievements may turn out to be substantially different in some cases. So, as you see here, this is an example of different categories of NDC target types that countries have submitted. And we can see that the biggest share is actually countries reporting on targets compared to business as usual scenarios. A lot of countries also have absolute base year targets, as with the old Kyoto Protocol. Still, 35 countries have expressed policies and actions as their target. 9 countries have expressed intensity targets, so GHG emissions compared to units of GDP, or it could also be per capita. Some countries have expressed peaking targets, so just saying that by a specific year they will peak their emission and then decrease emissions over time. One country has expressed an adaptation actions with mitigation co-benefits, and at the time we didn't have information on specific targets that could result in a identifiable target. There's also a difference in the coverage of the targets. So in the second figure downwards, you can see different sectors. So renewable energy, energy efficiency, transport, carbon capture and storage, agriculture, land use and forestry, land use change, waste, red, which is related to forestry as well, market mechanisms, or just related to sustainable development goals. And you can see the difference in how many NDCs cover these different areas and how many don't. So, most NDCs cover renewable energy, and more than half of them actually have it as a focus area, while looking at other sectors, it differs. So having all these differences between the NDCs and targets make the process of tracking also way more complex, that will need different kinds of indicators, and will also make the comparability of tracking progress and achievements also harder. But if you're not familiar with the types of targets, I will just go with a quick description. Looking at the top figure, business as usual is basically where the greenhouse gas emission reductions are calculated compared to a baseline scenario compared in future years. So projected into the future. So an example could be a 20% emission reductions compared to what we expect emissions would be in 2030. An absolute target is emissions reductions to be achieved in a given year compared to a defined level in the past. So a year we compare to, a year into the future, and a reduction in between without projections of increased emissions. So for example, 20% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. Policies and actions, they're not necessarily linked to a quantified, they're not even necessarily linked to a quantified emission reduction, or they might be. So for some countries, it is just a description of implementation of renewable energy or energy efficiency policies over a given period. And for a lot of countries, they also provided some quantification, and we look at the potential indicators later. For intensity targets, basically emissions are linked with socioeconomic indicators, so reducing emissions per unit of GDP or population. So we have some indicators that we can work with here. For peaking targets, it basically implies a commitment to reach a peak in a single year or period. So some countries have provided information that they will peak in 2030. Other countries have provided information that they will peak between 2027 and 2032, for instance. And this is to be followed by decreasing emissions. Adaptation with mitigation co-benefits is basically where any emission reduction is to be achieved as a co-benefit of an adaptation action. So it might be a country that implements afforestation policies to increase adaptation and resilience, and has not necessarily put so much emphasis on the quantification of emission reductions given by these policies, or it might also have provided information on that. So basically the target types of the NDCs, they do not only differ but target type, but also sectors or even the greenhouse gases affected. So it will basically be essential that parties clearly indicate their target type in their NDCs and identify a robust set of indicators for the BTR relevant for each NDC type and their sectors covered. And actually, indicators are first and foremost needed at the domestic level, not only for international reporting, but in the countries themselves, to basically evaluate the effectiveness of the country's policies and measures put in place. So now we dive more into indicators themselves. This is taking from the MPGs. So this is direct transcript of the information requested by the MPGs to go into the BTR. And it basically provides a detailed set of guidelines on the information necessary to track the progress in implementing and achieving the NDC. And as an overreaching criteria, each party will be required to identify and select its indicators to track progress. I already showed some of this information during the presentation on the BTR, but the choice of indicators is actually self-determined by each party, but they have to be relevant to the party's NDC and may either be qualitative or quantitative. So it's up to the countries themselves to define it. And more specifically, for each indicator, parties have to provide the following details. So the description of methodologies and accounting approaches that are used, a description of how the indicators selected are relevant to the respective NDCs, information for the reference points, so levels of years, baselines, or starting points, information for each previous reporting year during the implementation of the NDC, so information on what the levels in the previous NDC submission period, and the most recent information available for such each indicator. And building on this information in the BTR, parties will have to track progress towards the implementation of the overall targets and achievement of the NDC targets. And this is done by comparing the most recent information related to the indicators with the respective reference point levels, years, baselines, etc. Moreover, in the first BTR containing information on the end year period of the NDC, so if the NDC submitted goes up until 2025, the first BTR that comes on the same year or the years after, each party shall include an assessment of the achievement of the NDC based on the information from each selected indicators. And as it shows here, the MPGs also provide a sample list of potential indicators because they're still to be self-determined by the countries. And these are net GHG emissions and removals, percentages reduction of GHG intensity, relevant qualitative indicators for specific policies and measures, or mitigation co-benefits of adaptation actions or economic diversification plans, or it could also be others, a set of indicators relevant for countries like hectares of reforestation or a percentage of renewable energy use or even renewable energy production. It could also be achievement of carbon neutrality. Let's hope that will be the case in the future. It could also be share and run fossil fuel in primary energy consumption, or other also non-GHG related indicators, because countries are also, if they so wish, requested to provide non-GHG indicators as well. So basically, the selected indicators may vary significantly in terms of their nature. They can be both quantitative, qualitative. They can cover different aspects, like they can be national, economy-wide, or sectorial. So we also need the information, not only on the indicator, but also description of the indicators, methodologies, and how they were selected in terms of being able to make sense of all this information that will come in. So this is to try to relate it to Mauritius. And Mauritius has expressed both an overall NDC target, and it has also listed some actions, some mitigation actions. I'll only look at mitigation here. I will just touch upon adaptation by the end of this presentation. But basically, the NDC target is to abate 30% of GHG by 2030. This is relative to the business as usual scenario of 7 million ton of CO2 equivalents. So it's all gases that Mauritius track. So we talk about equivalents. So it means it's not only CO2, but also methane that can be relevant for waste or agriculture. But this target is conditional on international support. So we have a specific kind of indicator that we can relate to the different examples that were given earlier. We have a specific end year. We have something to be able to compare it to. And we have a specific amount of expected emissions in 2030. So we actually have a lot of information to go with here. So we have a target year. We have also a time frame, because I think in the information to provide clarity, Mauritius also provide information on the base year. So we have a time frame. We have with the activities listed, we have a scope and coverage, and we also have reference points. So we have something to work with here. In terms of activities, there is the smart use of marine resources. Unfortunately, the NDC doesn't provide a detailed description of these activities, which does not allow me, at least. You probably have more in-depth information on what the specific activities will consist of and can relate these activities to potential indicators. I cannot do it for all without having the specific activity data. But when we look at expansion in solar, wind, and biomass energy production and other renewable energy sources, I mean, we have indicators that we can use here to track it. And then it's the amount of installed power, it could be in megawatts, gigawatts, as you prefer, of renewable energy. And with that, you can make a calculation of the grid emission factor in the country that gives you the carbon intensity of the electricity produced. And you have an indicator that you can use to track. So you have share of renewable energy. With that, you can calculate and the information on the fuels used in the non-renewable energy sector. You can make the necessary calculation. Another activity is the sustainable consumption and production in all sectors of the economy. And here as well, for me, it's hard to identify specific indicators. We have a gradual shift towards the use of cleaner energy technologies, such as liquefied natural gas. And here as well, we need to know what the baseline is, but it's the potentially used the tons or cubic meters of bunker fuel reduced compared to the liquefied natural gas capacity added. It could be, without knowing the exact activities and envisioned for this. Another activity is the modernization of the national electricity grid using smart technologies to accelerate the uptake of renewable energy. It could be qualitative indicators here describing the activities used and how that has contributed to the uptake of renewable energy. If the modernization of electricity grids usually also lead to a more efficient use of electricity with less losses. So another indicator could be the reduction of loss percentages. There is the efficient use of energy through the deployment of appropriate technology in all sectors of the economy, and awareness raising on energy conservation. Here as well, without knowing the specific activities at the activity level, it's hard to define indicators, but I'm sure that you have more in-depth information and can think of something. And I assume that you will have these discussions with Sanju during your technical working group sessions. Sustainable transportation. I think here there are indicators that can be used. It can be the share of energy efficient vehicles on the road. It can be the amount of people traveling with energy efficient mass transportation. The last time I was lucky enough to visit Mauritius, there was an ongoing building of a new rail system. So this could be an example. So amount of people utilizing the system, and potentially also the decrease in car usage because of that. Climate smart agriculture, including biofarming. Of course, it all depends on the activities and what kind of activities are implemented and how to calculate emission reductions. So without the necessary activity data, it's kind of hard to think of potential indicators, but it could be, for instance, related to specific farming activities that work as carbon fixators into the soil. And with that information, you can make calculation of hectares of this kind of practices used and make estimations of greenhouse gas emission reductions because of that. And we have sustainable integrated waste management, including waste to energy. Here also a set of potential indicators can be identified. If organic matter is used for biogas production, we have tons of waste diverted from landfill, which saves methane emissions. We can have biogas production, which produces energy, renewable energy. It could also be incineration, which is basically utilizing the energy content in the waste and transforming it into energy, therefore displacing other fossil fuels. Then there is a tree planting program, and that can also be, indicators here can be hectares of areas reforested or forested, and with the information on the trees and their carbon uptake, you have information of the greenhouse gas emission reductions. And the leapfrog to low global warming potential refrigerants indicators can be the amount of refrigerants imported. That can be also maybe in some countries. I know that Belize is working a lot in, as an example, Belize is working a lot with custom services, so they track this information through the amount of imported appliances. So, going back to the more theoretical aspects, in addition to the targets and indicator values, countries also have to describe in the BTR each methodology and/or accounting approach used to define the targets, how they are constructed, the baselines, and each indicator, including key parameters, assumptions, definition, data sources, model used, if or which IPCC guidelines and metrics have been used. So, I mean, this is, it might sound complex, but if you want to calculate emission reductions, these are all thought processes that you need to go through. Also, there is a specific requirement for countries that partake in cooperative approaches, so the transfer of emissions or emission reductions from one country to another is an example. So there must be procedures put in place to avoid double counting. But also countries have to explain how the methodology in each reporting year is consistent with the methodology or methodologies used when communicating both the NDC, but also future reports and the national inventory report as well. And also, I mentioned this already, how double counting of emissions has been avoided, or emission reduction has been avoided. Here to try to contextualize it to the Mauritian context again, in the NDC, Mauritius provides this information to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding of its targets and actions. And if you compare this information to the previous slide, which are the BTR requirements, just to say, so this information provided in the NDC might be enough at this stage, but you can see that it already includes and partially covers some of the requirements laid out in the BTR. But for the BTR itself, more information than this will be needed. So Mauritius will have to go beyond and provide more information on its NDC target, methodologies, and accounting approaches. And actually looking at these things now and preparing for the BTR requirements will also actually improve the quality of the upcoming NDC submission if this information is provided here as well. So here, just to go through the information provided, is about the time frame for implementation, the scope of gases, the sectors covered, the sources for GHG emissions, where they come from, which global warming potentials have been used, approaches to land sector emissions, a description of the business as usual scenario, and the projection methodology. So here in these slides, this one and the ones to come, I'll go through some of the indicators, and here I think we can together try to see how these different indicators might relate to Mauritius NDC. So we have here indicators grouped in macro services transformation. This is just for economy-wide NDC targets related to the energy sector. So countries that use intensity targets, we have as an indicator the total CO2 intensity of GDP. It could also be per capita, and is usually expressed in total CO2 emissions, so in kilotons or tons, and we need information on the GDP, and it gives you total CO2 emissions, usually without land use change and forestry. And the GDP is basically the GDP at constant prices. And basically here for Mauritius, you don't use an intensity target, but you use a total target of 30% GHG emission reduction. So you already have, let me say, the indicators needed in these aspects. As I mentioned, you have the business as usual scenario with the targets levels, etc. So for the overall target itself, Mauritius is already on track. There are other potential indicators for the energy sectors, so the CO2 intensity of commercial and industrial sectors. And here Mauritius has as one of its activities the efficient use of energy through the deployment of appropriate technologies in all sectors of the economy. And these could be maybe looked at by looking at the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel consumptions in commercial, industrial, or institutional sector. So it could also be related to the energy used for transport by services, but this usually would have to be included in the transport sector indicators if you report by sectors as well. Looking at transformative groups, basically, Mauritius has, it's one of the activities, the gradual shift towards the use of cleaner energy technologies. And it could be then an indicator related to specific CO2 emissions of public and auto-producer power plants, if that specific action is related to power production. Going over to the next sets of potential indicators, still looking at the energy sectors. Basically, an indicator could be the share of renewable energy production, which is relevant for not the NDC target itself, but actually, I think Mauritius has a national strategy for energy, looking at 35% renewable energy by 2025. And if this is included in the NDC, then you have a specific target and you have an indicator that you can use. Mauritius also in the NDC lists the efficient use of energy for the deployment of appropriate technology in all sectors. And here an indicator could be the CO2 emissions from the industry sector. And this is usually from combustion of fossil fuels in manufacturing. I know that Mauritius has, compared to its size, quite a big manufacturing sector. So looking at the power sources used in this sector. Or it could also be, if it's not the fuel that they use themselves for their own energy, it could also be the final energy consumption. And if it's electricity, then you look at that combined with the agreed emission factor. Then related to the waste, sustainable and integrated waste management, I don't know if Mauritius has clinker production, but it's basically the amount of secondary raw materials like waste used for energy purposes and amount of fossil fuel energy displaced because of that. Then there are a set of potential indicators, but the activity described in the NDC doesn't go too much into detail of what the climate smart agriculture will consist of. So there are potential indicators that could be used if it's manure management. It could be the change in livestock numbers. It could be the change in nitrogenous fertilizers. It could be the number of biodigesters fed with amino manure and the tons generated. So it's a lot of potential indicators, and you might. I will share this presentations with Udesh and Sanju, and if you want, you can come back to them and use as a starting point for discussion in the different working groups at a later stage. For sustainable integrated waste management, potential indicators can also be the waste production, but also because waste production is also actually a part of waste management. So looking at the amount of waste produced per capita, and the decrease of tons of waste sent to landfill could also be a potential indicator used depending on the specific activities that you envision. There are also some potential indicators listed here that might be relevant for agriculture, like the burial of crop residues fixating carbon into the soil, the use of animal waste to the soils, and also something related to forest, which is land covered by forest, as I mentioned earlier, as a potential indicator. So, although the activities and indicators might be identified for the specific activities, the MPGs request also countries to provide additional information on the specific actions, policies, and measures that support the implementation and achievement of the NDC targets. And this includes estimates of expected and achieved emission reductions for each action, policies, and measure, and the methodologies and assumptions used to estimate the emission reductions or removals. And this information is actually already reported in national communications and BURs under the current reporting framework, but it's not in the same level of detail requested. Again, flexibility is provided here to developing countries as well. But for the countries that are currently working on, and actually most countries should be in the process of revisiting their NDC, according to the initial agreements, it should have been submitted to the UNFCCC 9 to 12 months before this year's COP, actually, but we have delays because of the last COP being postponed. Well, basically, countries should consider to gradually enhance or align the reporting requirements on mitigation policies and measures to the BTR requirements. This will facilitate the future reporting from 2024 and also will provide more clarity for the current submissions up until 2024. So here is a list of all the requirements described in the MPGs. So name, description, objectives. I think I underlined something here that I saw as quite important, which is the type of instrument that is used. So which is it, regulatory, economic, or other? And also the expected and achieved emission reductions. This is a flexibility provisions, so it's not mandatory. But also the costs, which I find also relevant because it provides the possibility to not only for international purposes to show how much the efforts cost, but also to provide an overview to potential support providers of the national contribution if it's sponsored by the country itself, and see the commitment the country has towards fighting climate change, or if it's for requesting international finance, it provides important information from international financiers to have an overview of the cost of these actions. So looking beyond mitigation, many NDCs also include adaptation contributions, and the BTR takes adaptation into account as well, although only being a should requirement, so not mandatory, and is structured in the following blocks. So countries should provide information on national circumstances, institutional arrangements and legal frameworks, impacts, risks and vulnerabilities, adaptation priorities and barriers, adaptation strategies, policies, plans, goals and actions, progress on implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and information related to averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage, which is a hot topic as well. Cooperation, good practices, experience, and lessons learned. And if you go to the MPGs themselves, under these main chunks of information, there are specific reporting requirements. We just don't have the time to go through all of them. But just to know that the MPGs are more detailed than any other current guidance on adaptation and adaptation communications. And this is the example that I showed earlier. And looking at Mauritius lists the following adaptation measures in its NDC into the following sectors: infrastructure, disaster risk reduction and strategy, coastal zone management, water resources management, rainwater harvesting, desalination, integrated pest and disease management, efficient irrigation techniques development, climate smart fisheries, improvement of marine and terrestrial biodiversity resilience, the health sector, and transportation. Unfortunately, looking at the NDC, the climate rationale for why having transportation under adaptation to me is not clear, but there must be a reason why it was placed there. In the following slide here, you can see some of the potential indicators that could be used for adaptation, and this is just a short list of potential indicators for adaptation. It's not comprehensive, and here I only took 3 of the adaptation actions and potential indicators that could be relevant for that. But again, we need to know something about the specific activities to be implemented to find the specific indicators. So for coastal zone management, it could be, for instance, changes in coastal flooding due to adaptation measures implemented. For water resource management, it could be the number of surface water resources with declining water quality caused by extreme events, or improvements because due to adaptation actions. Infrastructure, it could be number of households, businesses, etc., located in areas of flood or coastal erosion risk. And with that, I think I've reached the end of the presentations I had. I hope you enjoyed it. Now I think I'll open the floor to Sanju and for questions to come in. Please go ahead. I haven't received any questions yet. Please don't be shy. I'm here to answer them if needed. I hope at least this last presentation provided some additional inputs and insights relevant for your work. So I think we have one question coming in. Should the future NDC have more specific mitigation actions for better tracking and implementation? That's a question that came in. Well, I would say there is a guidance on the information to go into the NDC. I would always say that more exact information, the better. This facilitates clarity. It facilitates the global stock take as well. It facilitates the comparability between countries. And not only that, I think that the exercise of looking at the new reporting requirements and work with them when making or updating the NDC is a good exercise to prepare for the future reporting requirements. And also from a very egocentric perspective, working a lot with analyzing NDCs, to me, that would be a great help in creating more understanding on the actions themselves, the expected impacts of the actions, and the specific implementation modalities for these actions, which is, to me, is very interesting to see. But in theory, no. You could say that the requirement for the NDC is to have the overall targets or the overall contribution. You can specify the information on the envisioned policies and actions, envisions to implement or to achieve these targets, but the requested detailed information is for the BTR, so you don't have to provide all this in detail information in the NDC. I see there is another question coming in. Lots of emphasis on BTR. Does it mean that national communication is losing its importance?
Most of the NDCs that was submitted in the past, they include the conditional and unconditional components.
Yes.
Then with respect to the monitoring, and reporting, should it be with respect to only the unconditional, or how do you then compare your achievement?
Well, the conditional and unconditional aspect of the NDCs is basically to reflect the actual agreements between countries, that there is an expectation that developed countries would provide support to developing countries. And in terms of reporting, I would say that it's actually very seldom ends up being a very clear delineation between conditional and unconditional. Because in many ways, you could say that a lot of countries still receive support for institutional arrangement enhancements, for training, for a lot of things that feeds into what you would call the unconditional activities. And on the other way around, when you have activities or actions with support from the international community, that is usually never fully financed only from the international communities. The country, even for the projects and actions where everything, you could say, on paper is grant financed, you can see that the country itself puts down a lot of money, resources in terms of staff, in terms of own finances, etc. So the delineation between conditional and conditional in reality becomes more blurred. So to me, the reporting differentiated in conditional and unconditional aspects doesn't make necessarily too much sense. But reporting on the actions that are to be implemented, both the ones you could consider if you want that differentiation between conditional and unconditional as a list of actions to be implemented and tracking its implementation without looking at the conditional and unconditional aspects on one side, because you later on, when you report on support needed and received, you will report on the support received, so the actions that are conditional as well. So I would say that the unconditional and conditional aspects is basically covered by the reporting requirements on support needed and received. Then if you want to report and make that differentiation in the NDC actions themselves, then it's up to every country to do so. I hope this answers your question. We had the question on the fact that there's a lot of emphasis on the BTR, and if that means that the national communication is losing its importance. I would say both yes and no. The national communications are basically born together with the UNFCCC. It's not directly from the start, but after the UNFCCC was born, there was already a quick discussion on how countries would report back to the convention. Because without reporting, you cannot assess the effectiveness of the convention and the achievement of its goal. So national communication have been really important from the start, and they have provided a lot of information needed. But it's because of the fact that the Paris Agreement is a specific agreement within the convention. So basically, what would happen if a country withdraws from the Paris Agreement and you took away the requirement of reporting on national communication? That means that party would not be submitted to reporting anymore. And we still need reporting, even though parties are not part of the Paris Agreement, even though still, luckily, everyone is. So the national communication is still the main reporting tool, you could say, for the convention itself. And it still has the requirement to provide inventories. So without the national communication, you could risk that if the party withdraws from the Paris Agreement, you wouldn't have any information, all the potential way to still keep them involved in climate work would be less, you could say. But the BTR becomes very important, especially because now we have all the countries on board, because it's a way to track the targets of the Paris Agreement. So you could say that the BTR is just very important for the Paris Agreement. The national communications still have their importance. It's just two slightly different aspects. And for the years when the BTR and national communications coincide, countries might still have the option to just submit them as one report together, still following the ETF requirements and the MPGs. So we have another question coming in. Is there no indicators for livestock subsector in adaptation part in NDCs for Mauritius? What should be done? I mean, you can have indicators for livestock as well. Again, it's always very dependent on the specific activities that you want to implement. I have worked on livestock activities in Central America, looking at both mitigation and adaptation. So you could say that the activities that was implemented was the introduction of specific livestock practices that would both mitigate emissions, but at the same time also improve the adaptive capacity of the sector. And it was about introducing a lot of measures like going away from wire fencing to live fences made of tree and bushes that could also be used as a feed for cattle. It was about the creation of smaller water bodies to provide water and coolant for the livestock. It was about the creation of dispersed trees in the fields to provide shades. It was about the rotation of the cattle in different parts to provide downtime for specific parts of the field, but also now it's getting technical, when grass grows, it expands its roots, and then when the cows eat them, it sheds parts of its roots because they don't need the same amount, and that actually fixates carbon into the ground. So with all these activities, you could have a wide range of indicators. So for the dispersed trees, it would be the amount of planted trees, or the hectares of areas with dispersed trees compared to previous barren soil, the amount of farmers and hectares with rotation practices, and a lot of these different indicators you could use for mitigation calculations. But you could also, for the livestock itself, you could also calculate, because when you have animals that actually thrive better, so animals with shade, access to water and cooling, access to feedstocks close to the fields with the live fences, they actually found out that not only does it contribute to adaptation in terms of protecting the livestock from extreme heat and dry periods, but this also provided basically a better living environment for the cows. So it was about, in terms of adaptation, calculating the average weight of cows, because the better the cows had it, the more weight they gained. It was about counting for the amount of milk and meat produced per head of cows. So this gave examples of mitigation indicators as well, because the more you produce per head of cow, the less cows you will need to produce the same amounts, the less emissions you will have. And for adaptation, it would also be the production that you can sustain. If you have decreasing production or expected decreasing production due to extreme heats or other incidents, and you can sustain that production or even increase that production with your adaptation measure, you have an adaptation indicator you can use. You can have an adaptation indicators which could be the amount of sick days or diseases induced by fatigue or heat stress. So there are different indicators, but again, it will depend on the specific activities to be implemented. Another question here, should the country itself set its indicators? And the answer is yes. It's the priority of the country to set its own indicators, so no one can come and tell you that you have selected the wrong indicators. During the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress and during the whole review aspects of the enhanced transparency framework, there will be country dialogues where countries review each other reports, and there might be constructive dialogues on the user indicators we might expect, but it is usually also a sharing of experiences. So there is no UNFCCC police coming and saying that your indicators are not adequate. But of course, if there are again, the methodologies and assumptions used to arrive at the information that you provide, it should be provided to create clarity, and questions might arise. I don't see any more questions. I give the word over to Udesh.
Thanks, Federico. Thank you for your insightful presentations. I think the couple of last slides with the table outlining the indicators, that was quite new to us. So thanks to all the participants for all your time. And if you have any question, you can always forward them to us. I'm sure down the line we'll have more questions, so we'll get back to you, Federico. Thank you.
Yes, you have my email here in this first slide, and I'm only an email away if you need me or have a specific question or other issues. So it will only be a pleasure. And thank you very much for joining me in these presentations. And I hope we get a more normalized world and the possibility to interact in person in the future. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.